A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
You ever notice how the biggest moves in global security these days happen when nobody can actually see them? We are talking about operations that take place hundreds of miles above our heads, in the silent vacuum of space, where there are no explosions you can hear, and no smoke trails in the sky. It is all code, orbital mechanics, and invisible signals. We like to think of space as this pristine sanctuary, a place for science and exploration, but that era is officially over. The high ground has become the front line.
It is the ultimate high ground, corn. And while it has been a sanctuary for decades, the strategic reality has shifted. Today's prompt from Daniel is incredibly timely. He is asking about the recent revelation that Israeli and American forces targeted an Iranian research project focused specifically on space warfare. But Daniel wants us to go deeper than the headlines. He wants to look at the current state of satellite warfare and whether those space-to-space kinetic weapons we see in movies, the ones where satellites shoot at each other, are actually physically viable or just expensive science fiction.
I have been waiting for this one because the news out of Tehran over the last week has been wild. For those who missed the headlines, on March 16th, 2026, there was a massive strike on the Iranian Space Organization's research center. And what is interesting is that this was not just a random act of sabotage or a cyber attack on a power grid. This was a surgical, targeted strike on their ability to even conceptualize offensive space operations. Herman, before we get into the physics of how you actually hit a target in orbit, help me understand the stakes. Why is everyone so twitchy about Iran having a space program? I mean, plenty of countries have satellites.
The core issue, and the reason the intelligence community is so focused on this, is that space technology is fundamentally dual use. There is almost no difference between a civilian space program and a military one at the foundational level. If you can build a rocket that puts a satellite into a precise orbit, you have already solved 90% of the engineering problems required to build an intercontinental ballistic missile. But it goes deeper than just the delivery vehicle. Iran has been experimenting with what they call research satellites, like the Chamran-1 they launched back in late 2024. On paper, it is for testing orbital maneuvers and space-based imaging. In reality, if you can maneuver a satellite to get close to another one for a handshake or a repair, you have developed the exact same capability needed to disable that satellite.
Right. The inspector satellite that turns into a predator satellite. It is like a locksmith who also happens to be a world-class burglar. But is this actually a new arms race? Because we have had anti-satellite weapons, or ASATs, since the Cold War. I remember reading about the US and the Soviets testing these things back in the 80s. Why is this Iranian project such a red line for the United States and Israel right now, in early 2026?
It is the shift in doctrine. Historically, ASATs were ground-based. You launch a missile from Earth, it goes up, and it smashes into a satellite. It was a one-and-done blunt instrument. But we have moved into what planners are calling full-spectrum space warfighting. We actually talked about the beginning of this shift back in episode 582, The Silent War. General Saltzman over at the Space Force has been very clear about this. The goal now is space superiority. If an adversary like Iran can degrade our space-based collection, our eyes and ears on the ground, we are effectively paralyzed. We are talking about GPS for precision munitions, secure satellite communications for command and control, and real-time surveillance. Without those, a modern military is basically fighting blind, using 20th century tactics against 21st century threats.
So the strike on the Tehran facility was what they call a left-of-launch strategy. You hit the weapon while it is still on the drawing board, in the clean room, or in the factory, because once it is in orbit, it is much harder to deal with without causing a global catastrophe. But let us talk about the how. Daniel's prompt asks about the difference between Earth-to-space systems and actual space-to-space munitions. Herman Poppleberry, give us the nerd breakdown. Is it physically possible to have a satellite that shoots another satellite?
It is physically possible, but it is incredibly difficult because of the way orbital mechanics work. This is where the Star Wars myth falls apart. In a movie, you see two spaceships dogfighting like airplanes, banking and turning. In reality, space is about energy management and delta V delta V. Delta V is just a fancy way of saying a change in velocity. If you are in a stable orbit at 7 kilometers per second and you want to intercept a target that is in a different orbital plane, say shifted by just 10 degrees, you need a massive amount of fuel to change your trajectory.
So you cannot just bank left and chase them down because there is no air to push against.
To change your orbital plane by just a few degrees, you might need hundreds of meters per second of delta V. For a small satellite, that could be its entire fuel supply just for one maneuver. This is why space-to-space kinetic weapons are so rare and difficult to deploy. If you missed your target by even a few meters, you are now in a completely different orbit and you might never get another chance to intercept. You have spent your entire energy budget on a miss. Ground-based systems, like the direct descent ASATs tested by China and Russia, are actually much simpler in a way. You just time the launch so the missile's path intersects the satellite's path at a specific point in time. It is like lead climbing a moving target from the ground.
But those ground-based strikes create a massive problem that we have talked about before, which is the debris. I remember when China did that test in 2007, the Fengyun 1C intercept. They created thousands of pieces of shrapnel that are still up there today, orbiting at lethal speeds. If we start a kinetic war in low Earth orbit, aren't we just going to trap ourselves on the planet because of the Kessler Syndrome?
That is the big constraint, and it is the reason why space-to-space is becoming more attractive to some militaries, even if it is harder. The Kessler Syndrome is that tipping point where the density of objects in orbit is so high that one collision creates a cloud of debris, which then causes more collisions, creating a self-sustaining chain reaction. As of today, March 21st, 2026, we have over 10,000 active satellites in orbit. Most of those are commercial constellations like Starlink. If you blow up a satellite kinetically today, you are not just hitting your enemy, you are polluting the very environment you need to operate in. It is like setting off a grenade in a crowded room where you also have to live.
So, if the kinetic hard kill is too messy and potentially suicidal for the global economy, what was Iran actually working on? Because the IDF said this Tehran facility was involved in projects for attacking satellites. If they aren't building space missiles to blow things up, what are they building?
They are likely looking at soft kill and co-orbital interference. This is where the technology gets really sophisticated. Instead of blowing a satellite into a million pieces, you develop a small satellite that can maneuver close to a high-value target and do something reversible or subtle. We call these proximity operations. Maybe you use a low-power laser to dazzle the optics, essentially blinding its camera so it can't see the troop movements on the ground. Or you use a robotic arm to snip an antenna or cover a sensor. Or, even simpler, you just sit next to it and broadcast a jamming signal that drowns out its communication with the ground. It is the difference between blowing up a radio tower and just standing next to it with a louder megaphone.
That feels much more gray zone. It is hard to attribute. It is hard to prove it was an intentional attack rather than a technical malfunction, and it does not create a debris field that ruins space for everyone. But Daniel's prompt specifically asked about munitions launched exo-atmospherically. Is there any development on that front? I have heard rumors about the American Golden Dome initiative. Is that a real thing or just a Pentagon wish list?
Golden Dome is very real, and it is the big one to watch in 2026. It is effectively a multi-layered shield that includes space-based interceptors. The idea there is to catch an enemy missile during its boost phase, while it is still moving relatively slowly and hasn't deployed its decoys or multiple warheads yet. In November 2025, the Space Force awarded contracts for prototypes of these interceptors. They are essentially small, high-speed kill vehicles that would be stationed in orbit. When a launch is detected, they fire off a small munition, basically a guided slug of metal that hits the rising missile.
Wait, so we are putting weapons in space? I thought there were treaties against that. I thought we all agreed space was for peace and tongue.
This is a common misconception. The Outer Space Treaty of 1967 specifically bans nuclear weapons and weapons of mass destruction in orbit. It also says you can't put military bases on the moon. But it is actually surprisingly silent on conventional kinetic weapons. There is a legal gray zone there that nations have been probing for years. The United Kingdom introduced a resolution at the UN recently to establish norms for responsible behavior. But as of right now, if you want to put a kinetic interceptor in orbit to shoot down a missile, there is no specific international law that says you can't. It is a loophole you could drive a space shuttle through.
That seems like a massive loophole. But if I am an adversary, and I see the US or Israel putting these sentinels in orbit, why wouldn't I just launch a swarm of cheap decoys to soak up all their interceptors? We are seeing this on the ground in the Levant right now with drone swarms. Does that logic translate to space?
It does, and that is why the focus has shifted from protection to resilience. We actually touched on the physics of this back in episode 1194 when we talked about engineering density. The way you counter a space-based threat today isn't just by having a better shield, it is by having so many targets that the enemy can't hit them all. Look at Starlink or the Black Sky constellation. If Russia or China wanted to take down the Starlink network, they would have to destroy thousands of satellites. A kinetic ASAT costs millions of dollars. A Starlink satellite is relatively cheap and replaceable. The math of attrition has completely flipped. You can't use $1 million bullet to hit a $50,000 target when there are 6,000 targets.
So the Iranian project was probably trying to find a way to bridge that gap. If you cannot afford to launch thousands of satellites, you have to find a way to degrade the big constellations without spending $1 billion on missiles.
They were looking for the asymmetric play, and that is why the left-of-launch strike on the Tehran facility was so strategic. By destroying the research labs and the specialized manufacturing equipment for these offensive systems, the clean rooms, the vibration testing tables, the specialized sensors, Israel and the US effectively reset the clock on Iran's space warfare ambitions. It is much easier to blow up a lab on the ground than it is to hunt down a maneuverable satellite in a high eccentricity orbit once it is already up there.
It is the same logic as the strikes we saw on the nuclear facilities at Natanz and Isfahan during the first week of this conflict. If you let the capability reach maturity, the cost of dealing with it goes up exponentially. But let us look at the technical feasibility Daniel asked about. If I am in space and I want to launch a kinetic projectile at another satellite, do I even need an explosion? I mean, at those speeds, a marble has the kinetic energy of a truck, right?
The math is brutal, Korn. Kinetic energy is 1/2 mass times velocity squared. In low Earth orbit, objects are moving at about 28,000 kilometers per hour. If you have a head-on collision or even a crossing intercept, the relative velocity can be 15 kilometers per second. At that speed, even a tiny piece of plastic or a bolt has the energy of a high-caliber bullet. You don't need an explosive warhead. You just need to be in the right place at the right time. The munition is just a hunk of metal with a guidance system. This is what we call hit-to-kill technology.
So the real weapon isn't the projectile. It is the sensor and the thruster that gets it into the path of the target.
You've hit on the technical heart of it. The challenge for space-to-space warfare is autonomous navigation. You are trying to hit a target that is moving miles per second, and you are also moving miles per second. There is no human in the loop for the final intercept. The signal delay between Earth and orbit is too long. It all has to be done by onboard AI and optical sensors. That is what the US is testing with things like the R2C2 software, which automates threat detection and maneuver for satellites. It is essentially an autopilot for space combat.
It feels like we are moving toward a world of orbital stalking. You have these inspector satellites that just follow high-value targets around, waiting for a signal to interfere. I remember reading about a Russian satellite a few years ago that was tailing a US spy satellite so closely that the Space Force called it disturbing.
That was a classic example of co-orbital proximity operations, and it highlights the gray zone nature of this. If a satellite gets close to yours, is that an act of war, or is it just peaceful exploration? There are no borders in space. There are no no-fly zones. Until an actual strike happens, everything is just positioning. But as soon as a kinetic weapon is used, the whole domain changes. It becomes a minefield.
Let us talk about the strategic implications Daniel mentioned. If I am a country like Iran, and I manage to successfully degrade a major space-based collection system, say I blind a few key reconnaissance satellites over the Middle East, what does that actually change on the ground? Does it stop the missiles from flying?
It changes everything for a tactical commander. If I am planning a strike or trying to track a mobile missile launcher, I am relying on those satellites for real-time data. If you take that away, I have to rely on high-altitude drones, which are easier to shoot down, or human intelligence, which is slower and less reliable. Degrading space assets is about increasing the fog of war. It doesn't win the war on its own, but it makes every other operation much more dangerous and less certain. It forces the enemy to play a guessing game.
And it seems like we are seeing a move toward what people are calling sovereign space. Nations like Japan and the members of the European Union are realizing they cannot just rely on the US global positioning system or commercial networks. They are building their own constellations with built-in resilience against jamming and cyber attacks.
That is the race to resilience that General Saltzman talks about. By 2026, the goal isn't just to have a satellite, it is to have a battle-ready architecture. That means satellites that can autonomously detect when they are being jammed and switch to a different frequency, or satellites that have bodyguard units nearby to intercept incoming threats.
Bodyguard satellites? Are we actually doing that, or is that just a cool name for a project?
There have been successful war games testing the concept, and some of the classified payloads launched in late 2025 are rumored to be exactly that. You launch a high-value asset like a multi-billion-dollar imaging satellite, and you surround it with a few low-cost disposable escorts that can maneuver to block a laser or even take a kinetic hit for the main satellite. It is basically a carrier strike group, but in orbit. The escorts are there to be sacrificed so the carrier can keep providing data to the troops on the ground.
It is wild how much this sounds like science fiction, yet the hardware is being built and destroyed right now. But I want to go back to the Iranian strike because I think there is a geopolitical angle we shouldn't ignore. Israel and the US doing a joint operation inside Iranian territory to hit a space facility is a massive escalation. It shows that space is now considered a primary front, not just a supporting one.
It is the realization that you cannot win a modern war if you lose the space domain. The Shield of the Levant architecture we discussed in episode 1392 is entirely dependent on space-based early warning. If Iran can take out the infrared sensors that detect a missile launch the second it leaves the tube, the whole multi-layered defense system is compromised. You lose those precious seconds of reaction time. So, from a security perspective, hitting that research center isn't just an option, it is a defensive necessity. You are preserving the integrity of the entire Western defense network.
And I think it is important to point out that these space-to-space weapons Daniel asked about aren't just about aggression. They are also about defense. If Russia or China puts a nuclear-armed ASAT in orbit, which there were reports of them developing in 2024 and 2025, the only way to deal with that might be a space-based interceptor. You cannot wait for it to re-enter the atmosphere. You have to kill it where it lives.
That is the Golden Dome logic. It is about moving the battlefield as far away from civilian populations as possible, but the technical barrier to entry is huge. You need high-fidelity sensors, massive computing power on the edge, and extremely precise propulsion systems. Most countries simply cannot do it. Even Iran, with all their progress in rocket motor technology, was still in the research phase for the actual guidance and proximity systems.
Which is why they were targeted now. So, if we are summarizing the state of play for Daniel, it sounds like Earth-to-space kinetic weapons are a proven, albeit messy, reality. Space-to-space kinetic weapons are technically possible and currently being prototyped by the major powers, but they are incredibly difficult due to the energy requirements of orbital maneuvering and the precision needed for hit-to-kill. And the real war right now is happening in the soft kill arena, jamming, cyber, and dazzling.
You've got it. And the overarching trend is proliferated LEO. Instead of one big expensive satellite that is a juicy target, we are moving to hundreds of small ones. It is a shift from exclusivity to ubiquity. If the enemy takes out 10 satellites, you still have 9,900 more. That is the ultimate defense against the kind of warfare Iran was trying to develop. It makes the cost of the attack higher than the value of the damage.
It is a fascinating transition. We are moving from a world where space was this fragile, pristine environment to one where it is a rugged, contested battlefield. But as you said, the high ground is only useful if you can actually keep it. If we turn it into a debris field, nobody wins.
And that is the challenge for the next decade. How do we operate in space without turning it into a minefield of debris that lasts for 1,000 years? The nations that figure out how to do clean warfare in orbit, using lasers, cyber, and non-destructive interference, are the ones who will ultimately control the domain. The era of the big boom in space is hopefully ending because it is too costly for everyone.
I think that is a good place to wrap the technical side of this. We have covered a lot of ground, or lack thereof. For the listeners, the big takeaway is that the strike in Tehran wasn't just about preventing a rocket launch. It was about denying the capability to turn space into a gray zone battlefield, where Iran could punch way above its weight class.
If you want to dive deeper into the physics of how these intercepts actually work, I really recommend going back to episode 1194. We go into the actual math of hit-to-kill energy and why missing by an inch in space is the same as missing by a mile. It provides a lot of the foundational context for why the Golden Dome Initiative is such a massive engineering undertaking. It is not just about the rocket, it is about the brain inside the rocket.
And if you are interested in how this fits into the broader regional security picture, episode 1392 on Israel's multi-layered defense is essential. It explains why space-based surveillance is the linchpin for everything from Iron Dome to Arrow 3. If you lose the eye in the sky, the shield on the ground starts to crack.
We are living through a period where the silent war is becoming much more vocal. These strikes on the ground are just the visible part of a struggle for control that is happening 24/7 in orbit. Keep an eye on the UN's Norms of Responsible Behavior in Space. That is where the rules for this new battlefield are being written, or at least debated.
Well, big thanks to Daniel for the prompt. It is always good to have an excuse to get Herman talking about Delta V and orbital planes. I think we managed to keep the Star Wars analogies to a minimum this time.
I tried my best. It is just so much more interesting when you look at the actual physics. Reality is usually more complex and more impressive than the movies. A satellite that can autonomously decide to dodge a missile is way cooler than an X-Wing, in my opinion.
Truly. All right, that is going to do it for us today. Thanks as always to our producer Hilbert Flumingtop for keeping the signal clear and the orbit stable.
And a huge thanks to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power our research and the generation of this show. We literally couldn't do the deep dives into orbital mechanics without that compute.
This has been My Weird Prompts. If you are enjoying the show, do us a favor and leave a review on your podcast app. It really does help other people find these deep dives and helps us grow the community. We are seeing a lot of new listeners from the aerospace sector lately, so welcome to the fold.
You can find all our past episodes and the full archive at myweirdprompts.com.
We will be back soon with another prompt from Daniel. Until then, keep looking up. But maybe keep an eye on what is happening behind the scenes too.
See you next time.
Later.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My Weird Prompts, that's the close from sloth.